Hello, and welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for listening today, and if you've listened before, welcome back. Today, we're exploring a topic most of us can relate to: social anxiety. Everyone feels nervous or awkward around other people from time to time. But for those with social anxiety, these feelings can be persistent, overwhelming, and very difficult to manage. In this episode, we'll be exploring where social anxiety comes from, what makes it different from shyness or introversion, and how you can determine if you have social anxiety. We'll also talk about how early experiences and attachment styles play a role here, the mental traps and self critical thoughts that keep us stuck in cycles of avoidance and fear, and what we can do to work with social anxiety more effectively, which will definitely include sharing a variety of very practical research backed tools. So, to help me do that, I'm joined today by clinical psychologist Dr. Rick Hanson. Dad, how are you doing?
I'm good, and I'm a recovering socially anxious person, still in recovery. And so this topic, is one that I personally relate to.
Yeah, I definitely relate to, at the very least, a lot of aspects of it as well. And it's interesting how social anxiety can manifest differently for different people. When I was sort of learning about it to prepare for this episode, I didn't really view myself as the classic socially anxious person. I can come across as very extroverted because I am very gregarious, very into other people. But absolutely in the background, that anxiety is operating a lot of the time when I'm around others. And, I think that's actually a great place to start here, Dad. How do you think about social anxiety? What is social anxiety?
It's normal to feel a little uneasy or apprehensive stepping into a social situation, especially if it's kind of got high stakes. You're meeting some people for the first time at work, you're meeting your partner's parents, something is happening, you're being evaluated in some way. A little bit of that is completely normal. And actually, it's interesting that there's a curvilinear upside down relationship between anxiety and performance. So if you kind of imagine, you're laughing at my geekiness already.
Which is the word curvilinear appearing in the first 3 minutes of our podcast is the most being well thing I can possibly imagine here. But all right, keep rolling, Dad. I didn't want to cut you off.
It's great, but it's true in general too. Okay, so imagine the y-axis is performance and the x-axis, maybe from that perspective, is degree of anxiety. So super low anxiety, you're totally not on edge at all, low performance. Super high anxiety, you're really
also low performance.
Low performance. It's in that mid-range. So you have an inverted U that describes it.
As long as we're here, you're referencing stuff that actually comes from some of the research on flow and other performance states like that. And it's a very consistent finding.
Yeah. So it's okay. And we don't want to be anxious about anxiety because then it's, as they say in Buddhism, dukkha dukkha, suffering about suffering. And, we don't want to add that. So a little bit is completely normal, completely understandable. In that context, what is referred to as social anxiety is an anxiety that is minimally distressing and potentially dysfunctional, way out of proportion to what is actually occurring. Walking on stage at, America's Got Talent, it's appropriate for your heart to be pounding. But it's when it is markedly distressing and or dysfunctional, way out of proportion to what's happening, bingo. And in particular, if there's a pattern of it. So this is not a one-off situation. It's a tendency, right? So the tendency we often know is true that, I don't need to be so nervous. Maybe other people tell us we don't need to be so nervous, but the truth is we're really nervous. And then we get caught in this vicious cycle because our body is activated in very primal ways. It starts scanning for threats. And it will find them anywhere. So now because we're nervous, we scan for threat, we increase the sense of threat. They look away from you when you start to talk a little bit or they turn towards somebody else.
Yeah.
You immediately
find more things to be anxious about. Totally.
Yeah, you immediately interpret that as rejection, which then makes you even more anxious and even more frozen.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, as a boy, as a child, I was shy, but not socially anxious.
Yeah.
I started becoming socially anxious, which goes to a larger point that social anxiety typically develops based on our history. Anxiety is different from being shy or being introverted or extroverted, right? Also, socially anxious people want to connect with others. It's not that, I'd rather be home with my plants and my cat and my Wordles. from the New York Times. That's beautiful. I'd rather be in wilderness. Your mom does Wordles really well. They drive me crazy. Okay. There's a difference there.
We all have our thing. Yeah.
We all have our thing. That's exactly right. But anyway, so that's a way to think about yourself. And then kind of finishing, in some ways too, social anxiety comes from a feeling insecure, feeling inadequate, not feeling confident. And yes, to some extent, if we make sure we actually do have social skills and social strategies, we're going to be able to function better and be less anxious. But all that's happening on the inside. And from the outside, socially anxious people, occasionally seem a little awkward, but mainly no one would ever know it, right?
Yeah.
And aren't there examples, Forrest, like these famous actors or something who are incredibly charming, good looking, and all the rest of it, and they continually describe just having almost panic attacks before they go to the next party or something?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a well-known example floating around right now. There was a clip that was going around on TikTok of Pedro Pascal, I think it was, like reaching for his co-star's hand while they were up on stage about something, and people were like, what's going on there? And he came out, he talked about it. He deals with social anxiety a lot of the time. And this is something that they've talked about ahead of time. He's got a strategy in place with somebody who's a secure person for him. But this is like a totally charming, absurdly attractive guy who's having this kind of experience that we often attribute, to your point, to people who are more social outsiders or people who lack those kinds of social skills that we might privilege or think of as stopping us from experiencing social anxiety. But the truth is, anybody can experience social anxiety for any one of a wide variety of reasons.
That's right.
And maybe that is something that we could spend a little bit of time on here, Dad. Where does social anxiety come from? Like, where do these kinds of experiences come from that could cause us to feel this way?
Yeah. And let me just kind of plant a seed with regard to that topic. The person you live with or work with or sleep with, the person you raised, the person who raised you could be socially anxious in ways you don't realize because they're interpersonally competent enough, even if they don't look like a movie star. But meanwhile, underneath it all, they're quite anxious. And here's an important point too. One way that people manage social anxiety is by shrinking their life. So they then restrict their life to settings in which they don't feel anxious, but that bottles them up and makes their life smaller than it really could be. And so the fact that someone has shrunk the space of their life could be a bit of a clue, either to yourself personally or about others you care about. And also just taking into account what might be going on inside them. I still think of this line from Miller Williams, who talks about, we do not know what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone.
Yeah. And I think it also speaks to a common model that we have about how confidence works. We think that confidence comes from being good at stuff. So if I get good at stuff, then I will be confident. The one will just naturally flow from the other. And that feels very intuitive. It's one of those kind of heuristic ideas where it's not perfect, but it's good enough. And so we go, oh yeah, okay, I'll just get better at stuff and then I'll be okay. That is just not how it works, as near as we can tell. Because there's such a difference between having a judgment of capability. I dance as a serious hobby, for example, as people who listen to the podcast probably know. I know so many dancers who can objectively evaluate themselves as being good at dancing. They're professional dancers, they've been engaged with it for a long time, but who would not describe themselves as being confident in their dancing or confident when they're performing in front of a group of people. And sometimes you can even kind of feel the anxiety coming off of them in those settings because they're not comparing themselves anymore to just normal people. They're comparing themselves to other professional dancers. So it's one of those things where the goalposts just keep on getting pushed back for people.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think can be helpful to take a look at. Like, what are the models that we're carrying around related to our behavior? And how can we investigate those models a little bit more? Because if we're just starting from the principle that confidence comes from competence and you don't feel confident, well, then that must mean that you're incompetent, right?
Oh, that's so interesting, Forrest.
Yeah, and then we go to the self-criticism part of it so easily.
That's akin to this thing I read a while ago about animals in the wild who basically there will be some kind of an internal disturbance in their physiology, like, I don't know what, their stomach is upset. And that then sends up signals that make them feel unsure of themselves. So then they start looking around for evidence that fits that sense of anxiety inside, even
Yeah.
if there really are no threats out there. It kind of reverses, let's say, a rational process. What you just said there about confidence and competence. I don't feel confident, so I must be
Yes.
incompetent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so part of what we're going to be doing a little later in the episode is investigating how we can get a little bit more space around those feelings so
Yeah.
we don't have to buy into them as strongly, because it's the strong buying into them that then causes us to interpret those signals maybe a little bit more meaningfully than we really should. But I asked you a question a second ago that I do want to get
Yeah.
back to.
That's
Where does
right.
social anxiety come from, Dad?
So, one major kind of pathway involves relationships with caregivers.
Hmm.
So, if you have caregivers who are, reasonably attentive, nurturing, capable, over time, what happens is that the child internalizes a secure emotional base. And it starts out with literally the caregiver in terms of attachment theory, the first few years of life, providing a secure base from which the child goes out into the world, sometimes looks back to make sure that they're being monitored by the loving parent, and then it goes further out into the world. Uh, and so we have a secure base that is initially literally outside the child. With repetition of those kinds of experiences, the sense of having a secure base becomes increasingly internalized. It's a little bit like the turtle growing its shell, so it has its house with it wherever it goes. We grow that over time. When that's present, those resources are much more available to manage ordinary anxieties, rejections, embarrassments, awkwardnesses, puberty, junior high school, and all the rest of that later on. But when it's lacking, that resource is missing. And then, second, what's often present with children who end up with insecure attachment is a fair amount of either neglect, emotional neglect, or outright criticism, both of which end up with the child understandably concluding, oh, something must be wrong with me. Something must be wrong with me. And here's where I want to make a key point, too. Sometimes it happens that a person, including that child, to manage that, will learn how to be charming, maybe the jokester, the funny one, the entertainer. Uh, but underneath that is a lot of anxiety about feeling only as good as my last performance. And the love and the care and the valuing and the including I get is all contingent on me making them laugh the next time, which is useful. Behind that surface, maybe the outside is a clown, but deep inside that, is someone who feels very socially anxious and even inadequate.
And I think that that also speaks to some of the problems of the confidence comes from competence model, Dad. It kind of speaks to that a little bit, because
Yeah,
if you have any drop in competence, wow, all of the confidence is threatened, right?
that's
And that's
right.
kind of what you're indicating. Yeah.
Yeah, you're always on the bubble. It's all
Yeah.
you're tap dancing magnificently on very, very thin ice.
Yeah. And there was this
Oof.
great line in the book Resilient, which we wrote together, came out now like 6 years ago, which is 7 years ago, which is wild to think about. I'm pretty sure it was a line of yours talking about insecure attachment styles. It's we need to feel cared about. Particularly, we need to feel that we're worthy of being cared about. And I think that idea of worthiness also connects to a lot of this, that people who experience social anxiety often have, not always, but often, have an underlying feeling of a lack of worthiness, a lack of something to contribute, the feeling that maybe there's something kind of wrong with them, that they're not showing up in the right way in social events or social situations. Having talked with people who have some social anxiety, one of the things you hear enough is some version of, I feel like I just don't know how to join right with other people. I feel like I'm missing the bids. Jokes are kind
Mm,
of going over my head. Whenever I tried to jump in there, I just kind of can't jump in there the way that everybody
yeah.
else seems to be able to do that. And there is some skill development stuff there, maybe. But I think that so much of it, again, gets to the more kind of underlying emotional experiences that we have about ourselves and how that impacts our behavior. So, in addition to attachment issues, Dad, which we talk about on the podcast a lot, are there some other places that social anxiety might come from?
Yeah, definitely. So one is peers. That was my personal issue. And I think from things that you've said in the public record on this
Very
podcast,
much my own issue as well. Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
your own etiology. That's a funny word, your own pathway to getting into a pickle, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and it's also true the social factors, larger social factors bear, because what if you grow up and you're the only Black kid in your school? There
Mm,
were kids like that,
for
in my
sure.
school when
Yeah.
I was growing up. Or you're children of immigrants and your parents want you to dress in a certain way or be a certain way that suddenly exposes you to being different and then ridicule in your social groups. Humans are pack animals, and we can be really cruel, unfortunately, to those who are not quite like us. And you also have the pack dynamics in which people seek alpha status with their kind of alpha minus wannabes around the alpha dog, as it were, who then define their groupness through outcasts and pariah kids and attacks on them. So if that happened to
Mm.
you, that could be a major dynamic. Sometimes just being put into situations where it's hard for you to excel. Maybe you're a kid who, understandably, isn't very good at math, or takes a long time to learn to read or whatever, and you're called on in classroom, and you never have the right answer, so you feel dumb and awkward, and a lot of these sort of things add up. And then, of course, later in life, do you have people who really include you and see you and bring you along? On the other hand, in your history, were there things that were bumpy? And then you move into, early relationships and job experiences and all the rest of that. So there are a lot of ways in which people can get to a point where they feel really pretty nervous deep inside, stepping into social situations.
And I do want to mention here, we've talked a lot about nurture, like what kind of gets into us from our experiences. And I do think that if I were kind of placing bets here, I would bet that 60% or more of social anxiety is driven by nurture, but a big chunk of it is probably nature too. People
Mm,
have temperamental variation, you
yeah.
have genetic variation. You just might be a person who is prone to feeling more like an outsider, feeling disconnected from other people. And then on top of that, tendency you might have inside, all of those experiences then land, exacerbated, and so on. And I don't want to get too far into the episode without actually mentioning social anxiety disorder, appropriately acronymed SAD, which probably also has something to do with those more kind of like genetic or nature based variation that people have. So we're not focusing explicitly on SAD during this conversation, but sometimes it's helpful to look at something at the very, very high levels of it in order to get a kind of clearer sense of what it looks like for people. So, social anxiety disorder is this intense and persistent fear of being watched or being judged by other people. Even very everyday, normal social interactions, getting your coffee from the barista, whatever else, can cause irrational anxiety, fear, self consciousness, and embarrassment. And that's how something becomes disordered in nature, right? These fears are intense and they are far larger than you would imagine that somebody would quote unquote objectively feel based on the situation that they're in. Of course, objectivity is kind of a myth. We just have our own lens that we move through the world in. And that person might have a lot of very good reasons for feeling anxious or nervous in those kinds of environments. But for another person, they just might not feel that way at all and might feel totally safe, totally normal. And that can then create feelings of misattunement when you talk about these experiences with other people because you're sharing something, you're talking about something that you're profoundly nervous or anxious about. And the person is responding to you by saying, "Well, what's the big deal, dude? Like this was just a totally normal experience. I don't see the issue. Here's what I would have done over in a snap, no problems." And so what does that do? It just reinforces the experience that you're having of feeling like a social outcast, like you can't join, you don't belong, there is something deeply wrong with you. So what do you think about that, Dad?
I think you've nailed it. And I think it would be great if you kind of stayed on this clinical path because you did some really good preparation here and just sort of help people understand and, find themselves. As you, I
Yeah.
think, point out, it's roughly 10% of the population will meet the diagnostic criteria
Yep.
for SAD at some point in the lifespan. So 1 in 10
Totally.
people minimally. And I don't know if our listenership is particularly gregarious and confident socially, or maybe they're like me and they're, they're kind of recovering to some extent from social anxiety. But anyway, it's fairly common. So maybe why don't you go on through it? What are the
Okay, great.
official symptoms? People can kind of find themselves maybe there.
Yeah, so you were so the stats that I found were it's about 12% of the population over the course of a lifetime will experience that, and this comes from a Harvard Med study. So what does this actually look like for people? A lot of physical symptoms, very, very common. If you think about what a panic attack looks like, if you turn that down a little bit, that's sort of what somebody is experiencing pretty much constantly in social environments if they have social anxiety disorder. Racing heart, shortness of breath, trembling, dizziness, a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms are very
Mm,
common for people. Then, layered on top of those physical symptoms, are a whole bunch of thought driven, more cognitive symptoms that you have lots of overthinking, this kind of constant churn in the background. Will people like me? What will they think about me? Should I speak now? Should I speak later? How do I find my way in here? And then layered on top of that, a ton of self criticism. I'm dumb. I'm bad. I'm awkward. I don't belong here because I just can't figure out how to join. And maybe even in the background, some kind of feeling of I'm actually offensive to others. There's something about me that is repulsive or inherently unlikable. And that's why people don't seem to respond to me the way that they respond to other people.
First, I want to add to that, if I could,
Yeah, go ahead.
as a bit of a corrective to what a general tendency, I think, in the field of psychology over the last 20 years has been to really tilt toward cognition and
Hmm.
focus on thoughts. There's really, really important. I would say there's along with these self-critical thoughts and sub beliefs, et cetera, are related, as you all know, emotions of different kinds and the somatic markers of that.
Yeah.
Like for me, man, the main marker of social anxiety for me was just feeling empty in my stomach, like this deep pit, de-energized, kind of hollowed out. And I think you're getting to this as well, spacing out, feeling like I
Yeah,
was
that's a
trying
huge
to
one for people.
come into the
Totally.
situation through like brrr,
Yeah.
like a field of invisible cotton batting that I could not work my way through.
Yeah, no, right on. A huge one for people is blanking out, disassociating, spacing out. Stuff is kind of happening around you. You realize that somebody says your name and you just can't remember the last 15 minutes of conversation.
And
Very,
feeling
very
like an
normal one.
outsider,
Yeah.
like you're there, but you're not there. For me, it felt often
Third
like,
person.
y-
Yeah.
yep, that like from movies, I guess, but I felt like a lot. I was the, the orphan waif looking in the snow covered streets of New York, looking through a window at happy people having a meal together and really enjoying each other. While being in many social situations.
So what somebody without social anxiety disorder might experience, say, the night before they're about to give their career defining presentation or about to do a big performance in front of a group. That's how somebody with social anxiety, true social anxiety disorder, feels when going into much more low stakes situations. And so you create this pattern that's extremely common in any anxiety based disorder, anxiety based experience that somebody might have. You've had these negative experiences in your life, right? Real experiences where you felt like an outsider, where you felt like you couldn't join, felt like nobody liked you. You don't want to be in those situations because you felt bad. So why would you go back? I mean, it's
Yeah.
illogical to go back, right?
Yeah.
But because you avoid those social situations, understandably, even if you have friends, even if you have connections, they kind of stop bidding to include you in those situations, right? They heard a no once or twice, or you just kind of didn't respond to an invitation. Well, you're probably not going to get an invitation again. And this leads to you being even more isolated. all of those avoidance strategies, whether it's yours pulling away from others or other people pulling away from you, then strengthen the underlying beliefs you have, right? The brain keeps on churning on those bad experiences. It reinforces them. They get bigger and stronger over time. And then this leads to even more symptoms when you're put in those situations that are associated with those fears, right? And because this is kind of the model that people have with this stuff, some of the first line interventions that exist are more CBT ish in their nature. They're
Mm.
more about dealing with these thoughts, dealing with the beliefs that we have about ourselves and about other people, and figuring out if we can put a little bit of space in them that might help us interact with them more effectively.
Really, really good summary. And it makes me think about comorbidity. In other words, what
Mm,
happens sometimes along with official SAD, social anxiety disorder, or let's say what some people call shadow syndromes or, slightly subclinical versions of that are still really consequential. One is depressed mood. Yeah. We tend to accumulate a kind of sometimes a melancholy, a sadness along the way that may not meet the criteria for clinical depression, but it's still something to pay attention to. Second, it's really interesting that social anxiety co occurs often with attention deficit issues and hyperactivity, stimulation seeking. And when I think about, bouncy, extroverted, looking for action, very creative, bright, quite distractible, stimulation seeking person, I don't tend to think of that person as socially anxious. And yet, often behind all that overt activity is an underlying sense of unsettledness, not belongingness, not fitting in, maybe rooted in a history of being that kid in the classroom who was always kind of called out for being unable to sit still. Uh, Along this as well, if you think of social anxiety as a kind of dysregulation, and there's a sort of a dysregulation in issues with attention and stimulation seeking, there can be a dysregulation of overreactions to the ordinary bumps and bruises of social life. Nobody is loved by everybody, much as we may want that. There's going to be some ups and downs. Even the best book is going to get a 1-star review occasionally on Amazon. Things happen. Can we weather those storms? But if we're dysregulated and we start having what's called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, it's a fancy term for really having strong reactions to ordinary, sometimes reasonable moments with other people where they criticize us or they don't include us, that too can co-occur with
mhm.
social anxiety disorder. And then you throw in people with, additional kinds of neurodivergence around processing issues, people who miss cues. I
Sure.
worked with this kid once a long time ago who was brilliant verbally and could not read facial expressions or body language or small group dynamics to save his life, which led to a lot of trouble in first grade. And on testing, we came to realize that he had just hardwired issues with what's called visual synthesis. It was really
Mm,
hard for him to pull together the different parts of a person's face or a puzzle and assemble it into a coherent whole. And to do that quickly in real time, sometimes under pressure, first grade. And so there could be issues there with neurodivergence. People can be particularly sensitive. They get really affected by stuff. So summing up, it's hard to sum it up. It's complicated. When people are very individual,
I
and
feel
we're
like that
named
should be a boilerplate for our podcast as a whole, Dad. Summing up, it's hard to sum it up. It's like a good summary of what we're doing here. I like that.
That's right. To put it
Cliff
simply,
notes. Watch
it's
the episode.
complicated. Okay. All right. So now that we've done all this for us, all right. And since, research is me search and doctors heal
Yeah.
thyself, okay, Forrest, you and I are both recovering socially anxious people. What helps? What
What do we
helps?
do about any of this? All
Yeah.
right. Well, I got good news and bad news, and the good news is that thankfully, social anxiety is absolutely something that people can work with. I've improved some of my own experiences around anxiety. You've improved some of your own experiences around anxiety. There are a lot of success stories here, which is great.
Yeah.
Bad news is that the number one top line intervention for social anxiety is putting yourself in more scary social situations. Now, of course, you want to be
Just
thoughtful
don't
about
say
how you
it.
do
Take
it.
it back. I don't even want to hear
want-
it. Oh, that makes me anxious already.
Yeah. So this is, as many listeners will probably be familiar with, this is called exposure therapy. And the basic principle behind it, also just to say quickly, exposure gets a really bad rap for a lot of understandable reasons. For starters, it's inherently kind of an uncomfortable thing to do.
Mhm.
Also, in the dark days of psychology research, a lot of fairly sketchy stuff was done related to exposure that was, if not full on traumatic, borderline traumatic for the people involved, and therefore it understandably got a bit of a bad rap. The underlying principle behind exposure that I think is really helpful to understand is that your brain is a learning machine, right? It takes information and it creates associations from that information that then lead to beliefs, which lead to behaviors. That's how the brain works, okay? So, in order for you to create a new belief or a new behavior, you need new information, you need new experiences. And what happens with social anxiety is that the anxiety prevents us from getting any of the new experiences that could cause us to create new beliefs or new behaviors. Because as you were saying, Dad, we shrink the playing field. We make things smaller and smaller around us so we don't have to encounter those anxious environments.
Yeah.
But all that really ends up doing is reinforcing the anxiety because we teach ourselves that we can only be comfortable in certain kinds of situations. And if the situations are wrong, then we're wrong. And so we have to really control our environments very heavily in order to feel comfortable. So the top line intervention is figuring out how to help somebody develop resources inside that allow them to risk the dreaded experience, as you like to put it, and slowly expand the playing field of environments that they're actually comfortable in. So what do you think about that? Is that from a clinical perspective, fair summary? We doing good here?
Yeah, really well stated. And
Okay.
you're exactly right. I think about, in terms of exposure therapy, like a classic spider phobia, let's say. And it really helps to break it down. So a well done exposure therapy, uh, and forms a very strong alliance with the client about why we're doing this. So if you're going to do this on your own, because this is not psychotherapy here, right? If you're going to do this as a listener on your own, it's very important to understand why you're doing it and to mobilize various resources inside, including being on your own side, being for yourself, being a good friend and ally to yourself. And we'll talk about other resources that are really useful here. So you know why you're doing it. Second, you think about your challenges in a very graduated kind of way, starting with something that's extremely easy. And you want to basically move from success to success. Imagine you're moving up the 10 rungs of the ladder. The top rung is totally out of reach. You're not going for the top rung. You're just trying to get on the first one. And then once you stabilize there with that success, right, then you're getting ready to stretch for the second rung of the ladder. So hypothetically, with a spider phobia, there might be something like, first of all, think of the concept that another person might have. Think of an idea that another person might have on the other side of the planet. No, on the other side of the galaxy. The idea of a spider, very, very far away. And then you want to do something that's going to stir you up a little bit. But then you get settled around it, you get through it, even if it's a little bumpy, you're successful with it. So gradually you can tolerate that first rung of the ladder, and you've pushed back the bars, as it were, as you and I say, of your invisible cage, that first step. And then you do the second step. So now you might think about, your therapist might pull out a very funny, stupid picture of a spider held across the room and not even shown, just mentioned that it's folded in an envelope that's sealed in a safe in the desk. That's level 2. It's in the room with you, but it's that distanced. And then you work your way gradually all the way up. And dare I say it, as I did myself with a real fear of spiders, hold out my trembling hand one day and have my good friend John Casey with his pet tarantula place it alive and on my trembling hand. That was a 10. That was a 10. But I got through it. I got through it. And now I think spiders are the coolest thing. I think they're like the decayed remnants of an alien race of intelligent beings that, are now here on our planet a few 100 million years later.
You know, I think it was like a year or so ago, Dad. We did an episode where you talked about how when you were in grad school, you did the Rorschach test, the
Oh,
ink
yeah.
blot test, and your partner was afraid that you were psychotic based on your results from the test because you just had a very active imagination. I think we just got an example of that. We got the spider alien race coming to us. All
Well,
right, man. Yeah.
They're so intelligent. They're amazing. And they do seem very alien, right? Anyway, okay.
Spider silk, fabulous material, like one of the strongest materials on the planet. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, thank you for
So
that.
to take your example here, Dad, which I thought was fantastic, and try to systemize it a little bit.
Yeah,
And some of what I'm going to say
please
here,
systematize me.
and some of what I'm going to say here comes from Dr. Ali Matu. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's a psychologist. He's also got a YouTube channel, and he focuses a lot on anxiety issues and anxiety disorders. So I just want to shout out for that. I watched several of his videos while prepping for
Great.
this episode, so appropriate credit. To have like kind of a practical framework for this, you start by identifying, like you were saying, a good target here. So for social anxiety, that might be a situation that's very low stakes socially. It's either with somebody who is very safe, or it's an environment where the stakes are extremely low. As an example I used earlier, maybe your interaction when you're getting your morning coffee with whoever is doing that with you, your barista, or it's with a good friend, or it's a small group of people that you're really comfortable with. So you start
Yeah.
small. Then, before you go and do the thing, you can kind of pay attention to what's going on inside of your mind. Watch the thoughts that are going on here as you're having these thoughts about it, right? One thing you can do if you want to, that I find very powerful in my own life with my beliefs about things, is to commit myself to paper, to write down what I think will happen or what it is that I am afraid of. So write down, I'm afraid that the barista will not hear me for the third time and they'll blow me off and I'll have to restate my order and I'll feel really uncomfortable. And, that's just going to make me feel like very awkward and very anxious. And I mean this very seriously, just so you know,
Yeah.
like I'm not belittling this here. This is real experiences that people have. And I've had versions of these myself. Or, I think I'm going to be with that group of friends and they're not going to pay attention to me. I'm not going to be able to work my way in there. I'm going to feel uncomfortable. Write it down, like really. And if you really want to take it a step further, you can even put like a percentage likelihood on it. Like, how likely do you think it is that this thing is going to happen? Then you do the exposure. You have the interaction with the barista, you go hang out with the small friend group. And then alongside that, if it feels like it's going okay and it seems appropriate, you could even do something to put yourself in a slightly edgy situation for you. You just see what happens.
Yeah.
Because again, part of this is about one of two things, either A, having a good experience, or B, having a bad experience, but discovering that you survived nonetheless.
Yes.
And that's actually a huge
succeeded.
part of it. You succeeded. The bad thing happened, but
Yeah.
you were not destroyed by it.
Yeah.
You were able to keep on going. It was all actually okay in the end, and it wasn't quite as bad as your brain was making it out to be.
And with this, I want to put in a little plug for a bonus here. Notice that they did not notice.
Mm-hmm.
This is so useful. We become, as they say, morbidly self-conscious, right? And we think, as you said earlier, they're really watching us. Hey, guess what? Most of the time, they're obsessed with themselves. They're thinking about their argument with their boyfriend that happened earlier that day. Their back hurts. They're irritated with their boss. They're wondering what they're going to do that night, after dinner, whatever it is. They just don't care. Or if they notice, it's like, well, oh, whatever. And then they move on. And even if you ask them later on that day, do you remember what happened? They would not remember it. So notice that they don't notice. And if I can admit also, one experience I had of that is that the very first time I did LSD, My parents were not at home, and yet they returned unexpectedly. They did not notice that I was tripping very seriously on LSD.
Tripping balls.
No, they were a little oblivious, and I was a little tight-lipped, but, a lot of the time, other people, they just do not know what's going
They
on
didn't
with
know
us.
that their face was melting in that moment.
No,
Is that what you're
they
trying to say?
didn't know that. That's right. It's a
Oh,
relief.
man.
Oh, I want to throw in one more from one of the great all-time books, Sweet Thursday by John Steinbeck. And one of the wonderful episodes is this woman who is now on a date with Doc, who has a PhD in marine science, I think. And he's taking her to a schmancy restaurant with all the upper crust people that she's extremely nervous around. And she doesn't know how to act. She's literally never been in a restaurant like that. And so what she learns to do, and I think this is going to maybe some of the skills you've talked about, she watched what other people were doing, and she would be like a half beat behind them in terms of which napkin, which glass, and she slowed down. She slowed down. Often when we're anxious, we speed up. We blurt things out. We try to make it work. Instead, she noticed that the people who seem really graceful and gracious and cool, they kind of move slowly. They speak in a more measured way. They're relaxed. There's a little beat between when somebody says something and how they respond. So anyway, that's another thing to do if you're socially anxious, is to slow things down, partly so you can track more what's happening and respond to cues better, and also so you feel more in command of yourself. And you'll also come off as someone who's more comfortable.
I think that's great, Dad. And so I think it makes sense for us to talk a little bit here about how can we get to that point?
Okay.
Because exposure is spooky. We don't want to do it. Even when we're in the act of doing it, we need to develop some internal resources that allow us to get through the experience while having an okay enough experience. Because if we're exposing ourselves to situations that just give us more bad experiences, we're not solving the problem. The brain can't learn because it's just reinforcing the beliefs that it already has, right? So there are kind of two different ways into this. You can have some skills-based approaches here. For example, if you're somebody who's a little socially anxious, maybe you really focus on arriving early to small group things that you're doing with your friends.
Great.
So you feel like you can say hi and have that moment of like interpersonal docking with another person where you look at them, you say hello, you feel like you've had a moment to land. So you feel a little bit more comfortable for the rest of the night. So that's a very practical tool you might use. Or maybe you could let some of your friends, like with the Pedro Pascal situation, you let them know, hey, this is a thing for me.
Yeah.
And it would be really helpful if in a social event, you kind of go out of your way to hand wave in my direction every once in a while, include me in little ways, see if you can find ways to slide in with me, to have a little moment of joining. Hey, maybe I need a little physical contact, a little hand on the arm, or know that I'll reach for you if that's something that I really want for you, whatever it is. You just get that kind of positive reinforcement. Then on maybe the other side of it, we can learn a little bit more about how to develop internal skills of different kinds. We have those social competency skills that maybe make us feel a little bit more confident with other people. There are different ways in somatically, like you mentioned, Dad. Huge piece of this is body-based anxiety, skills for calming ourselves, doing some breathing exercises, some mindfulness exercises, whatever it is. But a huge piece of this is that mental chatter piece. Back at the very beginning of the episode, I was talking about how a huge part of social anxiety is this constant churn or chew that goes on inside of the mind.
Rumination. Yeah.
I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad. I'm doing it wrong, I'm doing it wrong, I'm doing it wrong. This is what they're thinking about me. They think I'm so uncomfortable and awkward. What are they thinking about me? What can I do to stop them from thinking about me or to make them think something different about me? All of that kind of stuff. Now, thankfully, you, Dad, do a lot of work with those kinds of thoughts. And that's a huge part of what you do. And it's also a huge part of a variety of approaches to anxiety issues, most notably those found in cognitive behavioral therapy, and particularly in ACT, and acceptance and commitment therapy, which I really love. I think it's a great approach.
Yeah.
And I would love for us to spend a little bit of time talking about that.
Okay, that's great. And then maybe we'll swing back a couple more times to things you can do actually as you move up the rungs of the ladder that will help you feel more comfortable moving up the rungs. And so that, and give you more successes to internalize,
Hmm.
which stabilizes you at a certain rung
Yeah.
of the ladder. And then going,
So you can
yeah,
move up to a more
yeah,
difficult experience, so on. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. I think if two basically taglines, maybe we'll turn them into bumper stickers, that are grounded in world class clinical psychologies, clinical therapies that have a lot of research behind them. One is don't believe everything you think. Classic bumper sticker, where you're getting some space, some defusion. You're no longer fused to the belief. And this is something that Steve Hayes, brilliant, wonderful teacher, personal friend we've had on the pod, founder of ACT, talks about a lot. We can defuse, we can separate from the belief. We can also defuse from, separate from the feelings. Maybe the feeling in you is feeling really small and invisible, and you want to get out of there, you can step back from that feeling and not be so run by it. Maybe there's a somatic movement in your body that wants to hunker down and curl over in a classic shame, withdrawal, subordination maneuver in terms of dealing with other primates. And instead, you defuse from, you separate from that physical enactment, and you let your posture remain open and heartfelt, head up, if your body can do that sort of thing. So you want to separate from all these things. And then instead, I love this part of ACT. It's acceptance and commitment training, or acceptance and commitment therapy, values based. What are you there to do? Why are you there? What's your why there? And to me, this goes into extremely helpful ways to reframe the situation that lower the pressure and put you into a much better position to be successful. And I call it redefining the game to one you can win at, right?
Mm.
So there you are in a social situation, and it's understandable that you might want to get people to like you. Well, what if you give up about that or set it aside? It may happen, it'll be a nice bonus, but your focus is on finding things to like in other people.
Mm.
Now, obviously, that's an incredibly good strategy, because those other people are going to be on the receiving end of experiencing that you're resting in finding things to like about them and enjoy. It doesn't mean you're going to marry them or hire them, but it means that you find things to like about them. You're warm, you're interested, you're attentive, and that's something you can do. It's in your control. It was a complete. Really, I didn't realize this myself. I had 10 years of massive social anxiety until I was in my last year of high school and then moving into college. I realized that if I could simply rest in being interested in other people, including girls, that I was suddenly quite popular. Because I was a guy who wasn't always tooting his own horn and trying to manipulate other people, and who actually listened and was kind of happy. And that's frankly fairly appealing. And it's not necessarily such a difficult thing to do. So that would be something I would say. So you might want to ask yourself, am I here out of service? Am I here to promote the good? Am I here to find the good in others? Am I here to rest in compassion? Or even redefine the game to one you can win at, to being, I want to become one step more competent. I want to help myself move, half a rung up the ladder. And I'm going to look for a little moment or a little opportunity to move half a rung up the ladder here. And just taking that, being brave enough to take that chance, to take that step, will be success for me when I, get back in the taxi on my way home from the party here. And I can feel good about myself that I did that thing that was a little challenging for me, but that's the game I wanted to win at. And indeed, I won at it.
To even go back a step or two before then, you're wrapped up in that stream of thoughts. You're in that group of people. You're sitting around with 6 or 7 other people, whatever's going on in that space, and you're having thoughts about thoughts about thoughts,
Mhm.
right? Do they like me? Will they like me? What can I do to get them to like me? What are those thoughts trying to do for you? They're trying to solve the problem of your anxiety.
Yeah.
They're viewing your anxiety as an unpleasant bodily experience, and your body and your mind want to solve that problem. They want you to stop feeling anxious. What can I do in order to not feel anxious right now? Now, the problem with that is that the emperor has no clothes. There's nothing you can do to feel less anxious right now. Your anxiety is a bodily experience that's kind of wired into you at the moment. So you're probably going to feel anxious regardless of what's going on around you. That's an unpleasant reality to accept, but it's a great one to start with. Because when you're able to accept that, right there,
That's really
acceptance and
great.
commitment therapy, yeah,
Yeah.
you're suddenly able to think about your thoughts differently. Because the problem is no longer, how do I solve the problem of anxiety? The problem becomes, I'm experiencing anxiety. What else can I still do? It's a total game changer that lets you get enough space around these thoughts to be able to do some of the things that you're talking about doing, Dad. And this has to do with something that I've heard you talk about in the past, Dad, lowering the signal value
Oh,
of
yeah.
anxiety. And I really love this because it's the idea that anxiety is trying to warn you of something, right? So there
Mhm.
must be something threatening because you're experiencing anxiety. But the truth is that for most of us in the modern world, anxiety is like a car alarm that's going off like two streets down. It's annoying and it's loud and it's a threat signal, but it's not signaling any actual threat. Somebody's car alarm just went off because who knows what happened, right? Somebody bumped into the car and okay, here we are. And they're, out at work. So that sucker is going to be yapping away in the background for a solid 20 minutes, if not longer, before it automatically shuts off. It's signaling threat, but there's no real threat.
Yeah.
And the more that we can kind of relate to it that way, I think the more space we have to do some of the things that you're talking about here.
That's great. And with that, I want to also build on letting things be simply what they are. I think you've talked about this
Yeah,
yourself.
for sure.
Um, I'm just in a group of people.
Yeah.
This is just a 15-minute talk I've got to give. This is just a job interview. This is just my partner's parents. This is just a first date. It is what it is. It's not to make it less than what it is, but it's to, appreciate it that it's one of many events in a person's life and to take
Mm,
it simply kind of objectively at face value, which then leads into um, stepping back from ourselves. I think about
yeah.
we should have not just cognitive diffusion, but self diffusion, or ego
It's
diffusion.
a lot of Buddhist practice, man, is right there
There
for
you
sure.
are.
Totally.
Yeah, where you
Yeah.
just step back and you go, instead of stepping out of this morbid self consciousness that's about me, 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 what do you think of me? What do you think of me? What do you think of me? And so forth, is to step away from that and to get over there with them. I think I've told the story. I'll just tell it again briefly. A real breakthrough for me about this happened when I was just about to give my very first major, major public talk, really about 15 years ago, when my career was just starting to take off in the whole territory of positive neuroplasticity and contemplative neuroscience and so forth. I was at this really big conference. There were nearly 1,000 people in the room. There were a bunch of famous speakers that were like very big frogs in the big pond. I was like a tiny tadpole, certainly at that point. One of the big frogs was, of course, Steve Hayes. And I was
Mm,
sitting in the audience, and it was going to be my turn to go on stage, for an hour talk pretty soon. And I was very nervous, and I was really running loops about how can I get them to be impressed by me. This is my shot. I want everybody to like me. Me, 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 me. And it just made me feel worse and worse and worse. So at a certain point, I just kind of pulled out of it and I started looking around myself and I noticed this newsletter nearby. So I picked it up to distract myself. In the back of it was a brief interview with the Dalai Lama, a page of Dalai Lama. And in it was something about the purpose of life, and large part is to be of service to others, to be compassionate and caring, and to wish that all beings be happy. Very Dalai Lama. Okay. And suddenly the light switched on for me and a switch flipped. And I suddenly realized that the most self interested thing I could do for myself was to stop thinking about myself. That my best odds strategy was to get out of my own head and to really focus on having a very strong sense of the people in the audience and be over with them in terms of what would be helpful for them, what would they care about, what would meet their needs, and to have that be my primary focus. And then whether they liked me or not, or were impressed by me or not, you know, I was going to let the chips fall where they may. That was out of my hands. But what was in my hands was being over there with them. And so then on the basis of that, I went up and I gave my talk, did my material, and I got the only standing ovation in the whole conference.
Hey,
So, yay.
Shout out to past dad.
So, now that's a success. It's a particularly good success. But the point is about getting out of over here that's so egocentric and getting over there with them, including, grounded in our values, making the offering rather than trying to control some kind of result about what they think about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that so many of those social anxiety signals are based on this very tight feeling. Like those thoughts are so tightly wound, those ruminatory, self-referential thoughts that we have. And this is not really an accident. It's actually based on some neural processing stuff that we've talked about on the podcast in the past. The default mode network, you can fill out your bingo card for that one. And these particular structures in the brain have a feeling of contraction. They feel kind of small and tightly focused, and they are extremely egocentric. And then there are other networks in the brain that are more lateral in nature, as you've mentioned to me many times in the past, Dad. And when we kind of are able to access those networks, which we can do using a variety of different techniques that we might talk a little bit, a lot of mindfulness-based approaches for people, it helps us kind of widen our view, takes us out of that egocentrism, helps us connect with other people. And there are actual things that we can do. One of the things that Elizabeth talks about, she does a lot of somatic work with her clients. A lot of that work is focused around dealing with threat and dealing with fear signals, slowly scanning a room, starting at the far left part of the room, looking at it, and slowly moving your head so you take in the whole room. And you see that, in fact, there is not a tiger in the corner about to eat you. That can be really helpful for people. Can you be increasingly with that kind of wide view of I'm just sitting right now, feeling the bottom of your butt as it connects to the seat? What does that feel like? Can you bounce a little bit? Can you just feel your breath going in and out of your body? All of these are things that help us extract ourselves from that very tight feeling and into a little bit more kind of openness and spaciousness here. And there are also things that will help us have more good experiences, because when we're operating from that mode, we tend to relate to people in a way, like you were saying, Dad, that leads to more positive evidence that then helps us correct the past information that our brain had. And these are sometimes referred to as corrective emotional experiences. You have a good thing now that helps you out with a bad thing that happened in the past. And I would love to ask you a little bit about that here, Dad, because this is kind of what you do. So let's say that the person did it. They went to the scary event, they had the little exposure experience, and it didn't go perfectly. Maybe it wasn't standing O, but it was pretty good.
Yeah.
Or hey, it went poorly, but they're here. They're here now. It's okay. They weren't destroyed by it. It was truly awkward, but they get out of it and they're like, oh, still walking, still breathing. What could the person actually do? Like, what could they do to help that information turn into something that the brain can actually learn from?
Yeah, this is squarely in our mutual wheelhouse of taking in the good to grow the good that lasts inside. So one is that it's really helpful to focus on granular experiences. You can, have the general idea, oh, they liked me. That's good. That's useful. What's even better is something that's even more specific, like the feeling you get in your body when that particular person looked at you after you said something with eyes that were warm and a face that was approving. And that moment lasted for 3 seconds, right? Before somebody else said something and they moved on. But for that bit, if you can freeze frame it, slow it down, and like, what did you feel, or what could you feel knowing that that was true, that that person actually did relate to you in that way? Can you feel seen? Can you feel warmed by their warmth for you? Can you feel befriended? What do these feel like? These are the key nutrients. It's like identifying that you're low on vitamin K and iron and B12. You need to focus on these particular nutrients. So you start zeroing in on kind of the detail, the specificity, the texture, the nuance of the experiences you can legitimately have related to what has actually occurred. So I want to, step one, highlight specificity and especially emotion. I mean, changing beliefs is important, but where we are mainly healed is in the basement of the mind. The superstructure, the paint job in the rafters, that counts. But where we're mainly healed is in the basement of the mind, in the foundations, which are emotional and somatic and motivational. So you want to be really in touch with those aspects of these healing corrective experiences. And then stay with it. As you and I talk about a lot, stay with the experience for a breath or longer, feel it in your body, and let it in, let it come into you, and let yourself shift around it. And be aware of what feels good about it, because that will increase the neuroplastic changes in your brain. That's always do that. And I did that one spoonful at a time, multiple times a day. And I've been doing it for many, many years. And I continue to do it actually, because I'm not completely healed yet. Then if we want to, we can do what we call linking, because as you and I have both spoken to, a lot of the roots of these issues are layered down deep in the underlying floors of the brain historically, which have to do with childhood experiences. So you can be then aware of two at the same time, aware of the corrective emotional experience, big, positive, believed, yummy, while off to the side is that little kid in you or those feelings from previous experiences, maybe in adulthood, maybe some rejections that still sting or some unfortunate things that happened. Maybe you were betrayed in some ways. That's off to the side and kept kind of small, and you're just simply aware of both of them at the same time. Do that for a breath or two or three in a row. Even better, do it longer. You can get a sense of the corrective emotional experience, making contact with that old material, including maybe very young material. Your intuition may guide you. You might find yourself imagining that an adult nurturing part of yourself is, taking that little kid in, that little boy, that little girl, or whatever, and having them sit on your lap in a very nurturing and soothing way. It's okay to go with your imagination about this. If that occurs for you, it may not. And then finishing, you can get a sense even that you kind of flip your point of view from being primarily focused on giving to these younger layers in yourself. You kind of flip your view and you can sense that you are receiving into those younger layers in yourself. You are being those younger layers in yourself that are now receiving these beautiful supplies.
I think that's great, Dad. And also it speaks to a certain IFS-iness to the whole thing that you can drop into if you want to, the recognition that we have different aspects inside of ourselves that we might conceptualize or characterize as parts, different aspects of personality, different moments in time that still live with us today. Often people will refer to these as younger parts. And for a lot of people, they have a first see, this is what happens.
Mm-hmm.
When this is what happens, it was not a pleasant experience for them, right? They have a first one in a long line of see, this is what happens when I'm around other people.
Yeah.
I have some myself that I can kind of think about that I still have memories of around elementary school or middle school or whatever it might be. And because they're kind of fixed in time in that way, they can have a young or youthful quality to them. And young people are inherently extremely egocentric. This is based on the development of the brain over time. Literally, the parts of the brain that are not about me have not come online yet fully. So it's normal for a 7-year-old or something to
Yeah.
be very wrapped up in their own experience. It would be beyond unusual for an 8-year-old to be like, oh yeah, let me flip the lens here and think about what I can really offer other people. That's not like how this works, right? And so I think the simple recognition of that there's that part that's operating in the background that's carrying a lot of this material can itself already be helpful because it can help us drop into some self-compassion around this sort of stuff for starters.
Yeah.
But also it can help us. I don't know quite the right way to put this, but essentially, for me, what was really helpful was having that coherent narrative and sort of understanding where these experiences were coming from that I was having in the here and now, and how there was that more emotional, relational layer to the whole thing that wasn't just about cognizing. And it
Mm.
wasn't even
Yeah.
about like feeling. It was about the emotional load tied to a moment in time and the way that I was transporting that into my current experiences. So
Yeah.
that kid was kind of like in the room with us as
Mm.
the current experienents were happening.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there was something about like feeling the realness of that helped me relate to it a little bit differently in a way that was productive for me. And I'm sure if we talked to an actual like IFS clinician, they would have more of sort of an approach with that, or a
Yeah.
way to think or talk about that. But that was just sort of my experience with that.
That makes it really real. I mean, we can
Hmm.
be, it's kind of a trope in the mental health space about the inner child and so forth. And that can be sort of abstracted for people, or they can have just a passing, almost visual on it. But to just imagine, okay, Forrest Hanson, eight
Yeah.
years old,
Hmm.
okay, is in the room
Yeah.
while Forrest Hanson, middle, 30 some
Early
odd years
middle
old.
age. Early middle
There
age.
you
I
are. Let's,
referred to myself as entering middle age in a previous episode, and man, did I get some comments about that. There were a lot of people that were not happy that I referred to 36 as like early middle age or something. But anyway, keep going, Dad.
okay. Hey, 36 is the new 26. All right.
Yeah, and
Anyway,
and you still think of yourself as being in late middle age. So clearly the lens is really widened here.
I consider myself in early, late middle age.
Wow. Wow.
Hey, delusion is a
Wow.
beautiful thing. you know?
We all need to have a little Delulu era here, Dad, and I'm glad that you're in yours.
That's okay. Okay. Like just thinking about that real kid. And there's some sweet things people can do here too with
Yeah.
pulling up photographs of themselves or video, or just getting a sense of, that real person that the 8-year-old was. And then imagine they're in the room with also this 36-year-old in the room who is highly appreciated and included and valued by many people,
Yeah.
and get a sense of them connecting with each other. Absolutely true.
Totally. Totally. A great exercise for me has been like, how would I feel as a fill in the blank, an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, whatever, if I like met myself today or if I saw what was going on around me today. And that can even be like a pretty emotional exercise for people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really touching. Well, I know we're wrapping up, and this
Yeah.
leads into kind of a last little subtopic that I want to enter into this way, which is when you think about when things became awkward for you, Forrest, and I'll answer this question as well myself. In what ways was it related to specific kinds of other people around whom you had social issues?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, yeah, totally. For me, it was like other young boys by and large. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, right there.
Totally.
And that's how it often is for people now, fast forward in adulthood. There's certain groups or types of people that they feel particularly uncomfortable around, and anxious around. And recognizing that is quite helpful, which then also goes to what are the reparative, corrective
Mm.
emotional experiences that are matched to those particular, origins of your own social anxiety. If you manage your social anxiety by just avoiding the kind of people you're anxious around, well, that's kind of sort of coping, but it's not really getting at a healing here. A
Yeah.
little example for me, because I was really young going through school, and my dad was a cowboy, but he wasn't athletic in any kind of sports sense. I didn't really have good sports skills, so I was routinely picked last. I had glasses. I felt quite awkward. and a particular kind of young man or adult male that was classically macho and kind of aggressive. I think of the popular kids, the people at the head table. And I always felt like I was having to sit in the back, whatever that might be for you. And then you might ask yourself, okay, what particular rungs in your ladder of exposure that you're taking yourself through would be really good for you? Or what can you build on that you're already doing? So for myself, looking back on those painful experiences of being picked last for sports teams with other boys and other examples like that, for me to do linking, I will very often draw upon my own badassery in rock climbing in the mountains
Mm-hmm.
and the intensity of that and being in touch with that is the
Yeah.
point that it matches to, it links to the specific kinds of social anxiety that are particular to certain groups, certain types of people.
I think that if I were leaving people with one more thing to think about, or one more, just kind of as we're getting to the end, we've talked a lot on the podcast about a general issue with the word disorder that people have. What does it mean to be disordered? Like, what does that actually mean practically in a modern society, in modern situations that have so little to do with the environments that we evolved in, or more normative environments for people, right? And so I think for a lot of people, they have this image of high functioning or ideal functioning, optimal functioning. That just isn't a real thing. Anxiety is normal.
Yeah.
The goal here is not to stop experiencing anxiety. Everybody experiences anxiety. If you don't experience anxiety, that is actually kind of a disorder, to be perfectly honest. So
you should worry
anxiety
about
is
that.
normal. Yeah, you should worry about that. It means we got to check your car alarm, buddy. We need a little security system here. So anxiety is normal. It's normal. No one's not anxious all of the time. So the target isn't like eliminating your anxiety. It's experiencing reasonable amounts of anxiety a reasonable amount of the time.
Beautiful.
And if we're able to get to that, we're pretty much good to go here. Today, Rick and I talked about what social anxiety is, where it comes from, and what we can do to work with it more effectively. So social anxiety is a fear of being around people, or fear while you're around other people. And this is often characterized by a sense of dread, a fear of rejection, a fear of being cast out or embarrassed by others, and all of these thoughts that are operating in the background that are very judgmental, self-critical, and are often wrapped up in how you're being perceived by other people. It's very normal for people who experience social anxiety to understand intellectually that anxiety is out of proportion to whatever's actually going on around them. That when they're around other people, they're not actually under threat in the way that their body feels like they're under threat. Or if something bad happens to them in a social group, it won't be quite as bad as they think it will. And even if it is, they'll really be okay. They know that intellectually, but it doesn't feel that way to them when they're in that kind of a setting. Social anxiety is often based on the experiences that people have, and it's closely tied to this negative cycle, a vicious cycle that people go through with it, where they have a bad experience that leads to anxiety. Because they now have anxiety about a social setting, they avoid that social setting. After all, that setting is painful. Why would they go back to it? But that avoidance just leads to more anxiety. Their brain hasn't learned anything new. They haven't had any positive experiences to counteract the negative experience that they had. So, hey, they just avoid it. So that anxiety gets reinforced, it gets strengthened, and that just leads to even more avoidance. And there are a couple of common misunderstandings about social anxiety that can make it really difficult to talk about. First, social anxiety is not shyness or introversion. There are plenty of shy or introverted people who are not at all socially anxious. It's also normal for shy people to warm up just fine when they're around people that they're actually comfortable with. And introverted people often don't experience a lot of anxiety. They would just rather be doing something else. Socially anxious people are people who really want to connect with others, but that social anxiety is getting in the way. Another belief that many people have is that confidence comes from competency. So if I become more socially competent, I will inherently become more confident, and that will solve my social anxiety. And also, the fact that I'm socially anxious is a signal to me that I'm not that socially competent, and therefore my anxiety is rational. But social anxiety is only loosely correlated with social competency. There are so many examples out there of incredibly socially competent people. We use the example of the actor Pedro Pascal. He's this movie star. A lot of memes about Pedro out there if you want to find them for yourself on TikTok. And he is totally charming, totally handsome, and he struggles with social anxiety. The overwhelming majority of people who experience social anxiety go totally unnoticed by others. There are many different experiences that could plausibly lead to somebody developing social anxiety. Like pretty much everything else we talk about on the podcast, it's a combination of nature and nurture. But insecure attachment issues, and particularly a form of attachment called anxious attachment, very, very common as a precursor to social anxiety. We all need to feel cared about. Particularly, we need to feel like we are worthy as individuals of being cared about by others. So, if you started life with a lot of experiences of feeling basically cared about, that can create a secure base from which you relate to other people. You internalize that feeling of worth. If you didn't have those experiences, it's going to be a lot more difficult to do that. And that instability, insecurity about yourself or about your own worthiness is a very fertile ground in which we can plant the seeds of social anxiety. Now, experiencing anxiety is not a disorder. It is perfectly normal for just about everybody to experience anxiety some amount of the time. In fact, if you don't experience any anxiety, that's probably more of a disorder. So we want to be careful about how we talk about this. But there is a level of anxiety a person can experience that rises to a diagnosis. This is called social anxiety disorder, or the appropriate acronym SAD. And we didn't focus on SAD during this conversation. This wasn't intended as either like a diagnostic tool or as a approach to treating the disorder SAD itself. But it can be helpful sometimes to look at more extreme versions of things in order to understand them a bit better. And SAD is an intense and persistent fear of being watched and judged by other people. Even very everyday interactions cause anxiety, self-consciousness, and embarrassment. And a key feature of SAD is that the fear is intense and irrational. It is out of proportion to the stimuli that the person is experiencing. And these symptoms exist in different kinds of situations, so they're not bound to just one situation, and they interfere with normal functioning. We then transition to talking about what we can actually do about social anxiety and how we can work with it more effectively. And the top line treatment for social anxiety is exposure. And exposure works by putting you into situations that your mind can learn from. If I just tell you that things will be okay, that they won't be so bad, that's not going to help you because it's counter to your lived experience. Your experience is being in situations and feeling dread. So you need to build up experiences that are somewhat different from that core memory. You need to get new experiences into you. And the only way to do that is by experiencing them. Typically, this is done by finding a similar situation to the one that elicits a lot of anxiety that is in some way easier for you or lower stakes. And that makes that environment a good one to practice in. So for somebody who feels social anxiety, maybe that's an interaction with a service person. Maybe it's an interaction with a small group of friends that feel more approachable to you. An example that was given by Dr. Ali in a video of his that I watched on YouTube was purchasing something from a store and then immediately going and returning it to the cashier and saying something like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't really thinking clearly. I was kind of anxious. This wasn't what I actually wanted to buy." And the point here is that your mind needs more experiences of either things going well enough or them actually going pretty poorly, but you're okay anyways. Now, in order to get to exposure, we have to be able to resource ourselves so we can bear the discomfort that comes with exposure. And in order to do that, we need to develop appropriate coping skills. Two big ways into this: skills and strategies. There are a bunch of behavioral strategies here. Arriving at an event early so you can say hello to people as they arrive individually. Letting safe people, friends of yours, know that this is something that you find difficult sometimes, so you're able to check in with them more effectively. Then on the skill side, you can develop some social competency skills, learn soothing skills. Body-based experiences, somatic experiences are a huge part of social anxiety. So learning how to calm and regulate them is extremely helpful for people. Maybe you can build up some more internal strengths, some of the ones that we talk about on the podcast all the time, like a little bit more capacity with mindfulness, a little bit more courage. These are all very useful things. But I think that the most effective way to work with social anxiety is by learning how to disidentify with, take yourself out of the stream of thoughts, all of the mental chatter that tends to accompany it. The root of social anxiety for many people is overcognizing, a preoccupation with what's going on in your mind and in the minds of other people. You're constantly doing, I don't know what to do. They're having these thoughts about me. I look bad. I look stupid. They don't like me. And it's going and going and going. You're having thoughts about your assumptions about the thoughts of other people. It's just turtles all the way down. And one of the first steps to doing something about these thoughts is by understanding that your anxiety is not actually telling you anything. Your body is built to believe that anxiety is a signal of threat, that if you are anxious, there is something scary happening out in the world. And that mental chatter is an attempt to solve the problem of anxiety. If I do these things, if I am a different way, if I just relate properly, I'll be safe. And when I'm safe, my anxiety will go away. But the problem here is that that's not actually true. Your anxiety is dysregulated. You're going to be experiencing anxiety probably regardless of what's going on around you because you have social anxiety. You're transporting past experiences into the present. So the anxiety is going to be there regardless of whether or not you're safe. It's like a car alarm just going off in the background. And that can help us disengage with that stream of thoughts, which is well-intentioned. It's trying to help us out. But right now, it's just causing us more pain without a lot of gain. This is sometimes called cognitive defusion, and it's the process of loosening the grip of thoughts on our identity. We create some distance from those thoughts, we have a little mindful observation of them, and then we can start to cultivate greater flexibility in the thoughts that we have about our thoughts. And a great way to get a little bit more space is to do what we can to be less self-referential about the whole thing. Social anxiety is extremely egocentric. It's very wrapped up in me, I. Here are the thoughts that other people are having around me, and therefore I should be spooked. So how can we flip the script on that? How can we shift out of that egocentric view into one that's focused on how do I want to show up right now? And this is called values-based thinking or a values-based question, and it's a major part of the ACT process. Rick tends to talk about this in terms of what can I offer to other people, and he gave a number of examples of that. Then once you've done all that, you've exposed yourself, you've shifted around some of your thoughts, you've had a good enough experience, or hey, maybe it wasn't a great one, but at least, you're still here. What can you do? You can really take in that corrective emotional experience. And we talk about that on the podcast all the time. Rick's taking in the good approach, and he detailed that again during this episode. So I hope you found this one helpful, particularly if you have social anxiety, but also if you're just trying to help other people out. I mean, speaking personally, there are so many situations in my life where, as somebody who's experienced social anxiety, I just needed a little bit of support. I just needed a little bit of help. And if you're able to offer that to somebody else, I think that's an incredible gift. If you've made it this far and you aren't subscribed to the podcast, if you could take a moment to subscribe to it wherever you're listening to it now on, or hey, maybe you're watching us on YouTube, that would really help us out. You could also leave a comment and a positive review. And if you'd like to support the podcast in other ways, you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for just a couple of dollars a month, you could support the show and get a bunch of bonuses in return. I also had a couple of spots open up in my coaching practice recently. I'm not a therapist, but I do some work as a coach. And if you'd like to learn more about that, you can check out forresthanson.com. And if you want to reach out, you can do so through the contact form on my website. Until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.